Good morning, everyone. And I know this is just the probably last session before lunch, so everyone's really thinking about what they're going to have at the buffet. But appreciate all of you that are in the room today. Appreciate all of those that are also watching us online. I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel because I get to sit with some of my favorite people in this sector, who I'll get the pleasure of introducing in a minute. But what I hope today we'll be able to get out of this panel is really how we're looking at collaboration between health systems, physicians, early stage innovators, but also strategics and investors to really join forces to address some of our most complex challenges. We know healthcare is complex. We know this time and this reimagination is going to take every effort possible to succeed. And so today we're very fortunate to have Lawrence Tallon, who's stepped away from a very busy hospital in London. He's a deputy chief exec of Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. Lawrence, if you want to come up. A bit of background about Lawrence. He was appointed as the deputy chief exec in March of 2020. As some of you know, Guy's and St Thomas's is one of the largest, if not the largest, hospital trust in the UK. And he's the SRO for the merger between Guy's and St Thomas's and the Royal Brompton Hospital in Harefield. This was completed successfully despite many challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, thanks to his efforts. He also holds board responsibility for strategy, organizational change, communications, improvement, and innovation, and established one of the leading centers really in the country that's called the Center for Innovation, Transformation, and Improvement, and is a board member of KHP Ventures. This is the Trust's joint venture company that's really focusing on commercializing technological innovations across our sector. Prior to Guy's and St Thomas's, he was a director of strategy and planning and performance at the University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Trust. And Lawrence has held a wide range of healthcare leadership roles, both in the UK and abroad, working with the UK Department of Health and the offices of both Secretary of State and the NHS Chief Exec, and was previously Managing Director of the Shelford Group, which is a conglomerate of some of the biggest trusts in the country. Thank you, Lawrence. I know it's very busy at the hospital this week, and you've made time to come all the way to the Grove, so appreciate it.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Nadine.
We're also very fortunate to have a good friend of mine, Chris Bischoff, who's the Managing Director at General Catalyst. I'm sure General Catalyst isn't an unknown to many of you. You're all aware of it. But it is, for those who don't know, a venture capital firm that partners with founders from seed stage all the way through growth stages and beyond to build companies that endure. He's based in London and he leads GC's global healthcare investment practice, responsible for delivering on the promise of health assurance, the health industry's evolution from a sick care system to a resilient and proactive health assurance system designed to help people stay well, bend the cost curve, and make the quality care more affordable and accessible to all, which I know is something we all want to achieve. Prior to GC, he was a senior investment director at Kinevic, and also before that worked he was the head of European media and internet at Goldman Sachs. He's led many investments in category-defining companies, many of which I'm sure you will be familiar with, such as ADOC, Avito, Babylon, Devoted Health, Livongo, Sword Health, just to name a few. And so it's a pleasure to have both of them here with us today. This is an unusual type of panel where you have a venture fund and a hospital institution within the NHS sitting together to explore and talk about complex challenges in healthcare. So I hope you'll enjoy as much as I look forward to. So first of all, I thought we'd kick off by just asking you both. I wanted to ask you about your experience in innovating in healthcare. What have you found to be the biggest challenge? Maybe starting with you, Lawrence.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Nadine. So let me just start off with I think why it's so important that we innovate fundamentally and at scale. And I'm going to particularly give some examples from the UK, but a lot of these are actually applicable across many developed systems, which is that we face a very fundamental problem of sustainability in terms of providing high quality care to our populations, largely because healthcare is consuming a growing proportion of national wealth. And I think in this country we've probably reached a point where the consensus is it's consuming the maximum that it can in terms of public funds, GDP. And so we need to find ways to continue to innovate, to bring in new technologies, new ways of doing things, to provide ever better, higher quality, more timely care, but without consuming an ever-growing part of the national pie. And most fundamentally, that means pivoting from a heavily people-intensive industry to one that will always be very much a people industry, but will take far greater use of technology and automation of both simple and complex tasks. And that's already now possible. But health systems in this country and other countries are quite conservative in their uptake of innovation generally and new technologies. And the main barriers that we experience are regulatory barriers, a hyper-conservative approach often to regulation. Now, it's absolutely right, we should have low risk tolerance for certain things we do in healthcare, first in manned drug trials, for example. But many of the new technologies that are now available to us, we can adopt a different level of risk appetite. Payment systems are often misaligned. Organizational systems and structures are often misaligned. And I think there is a real short-termism, often driven by political priorities. If we're going to innovate at scale, we need to be able to look much longer term. So I think those are some of the main barriers that I see, and barriers that we can overcome, but it will take long-term partnerships of the type we're going to talk about today to do that.
Yeah, and add to that a lot of people come to healthcare thinking innovation will be like in other sectors, and that you can go build some technology in your garage and just put it out there and people will buy it. And so I think innovation requires entrepreneurs, and a lot of entrepreneurs in other sectors are product and user experience led, while innovation in healthcare needs to be also clinically led. There's the risk that Lawrence talked about. And so blending that risk appetite of conventional entrepreneurs, but that risk caution of clinical folks, and really focus on the patient is challenging. Certainly when we look at it, that's the reason why we're so encouraged about partnering with health systems to drive innovation in the wild won't work in healthcare as it might in other industries. In terms of other areas of complexity that we see is the funding environment, not just from governments, but also from the traditional industries that fund innovation, tends to be a 18-month runway to go fund a business. And Nadine's an entrepreneur, she knows this all too well. And if you try to look at things from an 18-month perspective, it's very, very hard to build for the long term. And so any entrepreneur building a business always has that short-term versus long-term trade-off. But I think that's particularly acute in healthcare, where the sales cycles are extremely long. And so that adds an additional degree of complexity.
No, I think, and from our perspective to the innovators in the room as well, I think it's encouraging to hear both from the institution that's trying to be more creative and more bold and saying there are certain things we need to be careful about, but there's certain areas where we can really just be a bit more bold and ambitious and kind of push the envelope a bit. But equally, funds thinking about, let's think beyond 18 months, because I agree with the sales cycles and all those delays that we're even seeing now with the markets, the incentives are not aligned and it becomes very hard to sort of drive a business for scale. Of course, one of the exciting things I'm very encouraged about is an announcement today that Guy's and St. Thomas's and General Catalyst are partnering. I don't want to steal your thunder. I'm sure it'll be in the press as well. But one of the key components that these two groups are coming together to really help evolve and accelerate the innovation cluster in London. I'd love to start with you, Chris. How do you see this partnership helping or hopefully giving us a better chance of addressing some of the challenges, both for this population, of course, in London, but beyond as well?
Yeah, so first of all, we're delighted by the partnership. And
maybe you could give the audience a bit more detail about the partnership.
It's the first such partnership we're making in Europe with the health system. And obviously, when we thought about it, we've talked to a number of leading European health systems, and the chance to sit down and work with GSTT as they think about their future and transform their business at a strategic level was something that was deeply interesting to us, and we thought we could help. Obviously, GSTT is a leader in the UK, serving 8 million people, largely in South London, and we hope a beachhead or a lighthouse for further work and partnerships that we see that could develop a period of time. When we think about these partnerships, and we have a number in the US, ranging from Intermountain, a big integrated system that many of you may know, to 3 others that announced and 5 more that are in the works, we think about, can we take a long-term perspective on working with them in what they need in terms of delivering change, and be that conduit to sort of match if you will, the incumbency with the innovators without. GSTT will know better than any startup how to deliver care. But as we think about the new modalities of care, as we think about technology and how technology can drive transformation, bringing together the two sides, matching them in an appropriate way, and funding them, which we can do, because ultimately we take risk capital and put it to work to fund new ideas. So we're terrifically excited by this. As I said, this is not our first partnership, so GSTT doesn't need to be a guinea pig here. It's working in the US, and we have a lot of learning. We already have a number of companies we built with health systems in the US where we've co-identified problems, and we can talk about some of those problems, and then found solutions either to build together with them or invest alongside them to roll out to populations. And that negates one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier, which is this long sales cycle and this short-term funding horizon that a lot of startups have. If you actually have a system that knows what they want, and you have entrepreneurs prepared to build what the systems need, then everybody can take a little bit more risk in building the solutions to serve the populations.
Let me just echo Chris's comments as well. We are, Guy's and St Thomas, is very, very excited about this partnership, which is really novel and new for an NHS trust, not necessarily as novel and new as it is for Chris in the US, but this is really groundbreaking for us. We're delighted to partner with GC, its reach, its scale, its reputation, but also the other partners that are in the health assurance program. This is a terrific network for us to join. We're very proud to have been invited. It seems to me that we don't have a problem with invention in health innovation. We have a problem with adoption and scale. And one of the things that we believe we can bring to this partnership that is a complementary capability to those that Chris and his network have is the ability to be a translational testbed. So we've got loads of products out there in healthcare that can't get into deployment, can't get into the market, can't get into the public or private markets. Guy's and St Thomas's, as Nadine said, we are large scale. We provide pretty much the full span of health services to an incredibly diverse population. Nadine and I often use the phrase that we have the world's population in South London. Huge number of, over 100 languages spoken, huge number of ethnic groups, great socioeconomic diversity. So if you can make a product work in South London, there's a very good chance you can make it work anywhere in the world, and including in the very fast-growing markets of Africa and Asia. What we don't have within the public sector in this country is the ability to take to that kind of risk capital. And actually, I hope no one in this room has had to be involved, as I have, with writing a business case in the National Health Service in the country. and I would counsel you against it if you can ever avoid it. Much as I love the NHS, there is a mindset that every pound or every dollar spent has to be accounted for 20 years out, and you have to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen 20 years out. And innovation does not work like that, of course. So the ability to team venture capital with a real operational testbed, I think, is very exciting. But crucially for me, people often say to me, what works in these kind of industry public partnerships? I think you've got to have a number of things. Number one, you've got to have shared strategic alignment. You've got to be trying to create the right thing. And I talk about, just very simply, better, faster, fairer healthcare for our populations, near and far. You can't have a transactional type relationship to these things. It's got to be built on partnership, because these things ebb and flow. You have peaks and troughs, and you've got to be in it for the long haul, which I think is crucial. And thirdly, and crucially, you've got to have chemistry. You've got the leadership of the different organizations has got to want to work together and stick with it. And I think that's why I'm excited about this partnership, because I think we have those crucial ingredients.
I mean, I think it's hugely exciting also with my entrepreneur hat on. I mean, that's often been that kind of the missing of the trifecta. You want to have the capital, you want to have the entrepreneurs that are willing to innovate and do those sort of hard miles to get their solution into healthcare. But then you need to have that kind of health system, the test bed, the scalable system that enables you to really test it. Because doing a pilot is one thing. And you can have, pilotitis or whatever other words people use, but being able to then translate that into a system that is treating 5 million patients, that's got the diversity, the operational friction sometimes that can happen within those is really key. And so by bringing these three together, we hope will sort of unlock and remove some of that friction and enable us to really co-develop solutions that are going to address the fundamental challenges that we face day in, day out in the healthcare. So it's exciting to see how this develops, and I'm sure we'll come back next year to LSI and let them know how we've done, if Scott will have us back next year. One thing I know, I love to sort of get into some examples, and I think maybe, Chris, it'd be really good to bring this to life, to talk about some of the verticals where you see this cluster initially focusing. We've talked about patient monitoring, remote care, ambulatory. It may be that you might want to give us some examples from the states that have succeeded that you could imagine translating well here, or just through some of the discussions you've been having with GSTT and the NHS.
Absolutely. Look, locally, you can see that there's some issues around access to hospital care, and there's also been this development of virtual wards. The UK has half the number of hospital beds per capita to the OECD, and a quarter of that of a country like Germany. So clearly we have a shortage of beds, and as we all know, we have lots of patients that need care, right? So thinking through taking healthcare, making healthcare at any address, including your home, is a really interesting idea. Now, it's really complex, right? And it could only ever be achieved in a partnership structure. It's not like an innovator can sort of stand alone build that, because the flow of the patients needs to come primarily through the hospital, some through the ED, but also, hopefully in a future world, the preventative side to stop them even getting close to the hospital. But you need software, you need clinical skills, you need customer service, you need logistics. These are very, very complex operational businesses, but could go hand in hand with the care delivered in the hospital. And so that's, I think, a really interesting opportunity. Again, it goes beyond technology. It's technology plus services that's powerful. We certainly, looked at CRM, and there's obviously a number of solutions already in the UK, but in the US, I think a lot of hospital systems are increasingly getting compensated by CMS in terms of the NPS of the system. And there's lots of pros to NPS, but it's actually a pretty interesting perspective. What does the patient actually feel about the care they've been delivered, aside from the clinical aspect of that? So how can we reimagine CRM and take a lot of the burden of the administrative part of CRM away from the nurses and the like, so they can focus on the core clinical skills they were trained to deploy. So I think that's very interesting. You mentioned AI. We're excited about the opportunity, both on the sort of back end infrastructure side. We know there's just countless dollars or pounds sterling caught up in effectively billing, coding, administrative layers in hospitals. So if we could cut that budget, that nobody actually wants to do, that is inefficient, that will create enormous opportunity, I think, for capital to be redeployed elsewhere. But I think we're also interested on the clinical side. We've seen AI being used in computer vision a lot in radiology, and a little bit in cardiology. But as we look at the future, there's a way to take that beyond those to other to certain pathologies that are not really covered, and also help hospital systems think around, well, look, is there a kind of common enterprise level AI solution here, rather than a point solution for this, a point solution for that, a point solution for the other, and where, given AI, am I sure about, the data integrity? Am I sure about the data equity in terms of, looking at people, having a large enough sample set. So, we're very excited around those two areas, or three areas, as an example. But, frankly, we are most focused on delivering solutions that the systems need. We're not going to go build stuff that's just not needed. We have to help identify what are those strategic long-term goals, and can we embed innovation to deliver them.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that, Chris. And just one thing about the sort of the human behavioural aspects of this. So one of the things that we've got in our organisation, 25,000 people, the large majority of those are direct caregivers. They love this stuff. This actually is why they come to work. It excites them, because actually it's quite hard to be constantly doing the same thing day in, day out, and they enjoy being involved with this sort of innovation. So one of the things that we've done with KHP Ventures, the commercial arm that we are, that Nadine introduced earlier, is that when we're evaluating a product, when we're doing our clinical due diligence, we can just call up, leading clinicians from any specialty. And this isn't a hassle for them. This is something they enjoy doing. It's an added value part of working at an academic medical center as opposed to a more of a local hospital. So we've got huge expertise available to us. And the beauty of this partnership is we don't have to put in place an SLA to contract for that. We just use our hospital network to do that. They can also help us identify the real pinch points. So as Chris said, not like other industries where someone sits in a garage, develops a perfect consumer product, but what are actually the pinch points in the health system? And very, very largely, they are around increasingly sophisticated diagnostics. So in this country, we have about nearly 7 million people waiting for hospital-based care. That has obviously shot up during the pandemic, but actually the trend was growing for a while. A huge amount of that waiting is non-value-added waiting to get in for diagnostics. And of course, increasingly, the way medicine is practiced, we're going up the diagnostic scale. Increasingly, we're imaging in more sophisticated ways. That is exactly the kind of thing where AI has real-world application actually now, but certainly in the coming years. If we could get over some of the institutional inertia and nervousness about adopting some of these products that are already in the market, already validated, and frankly, in some cases, are more accurate than humans. Now, you may not go the whole hog and straight away have a machine read your MRI image, but you may have a first read and a final read by a human rather than 2 reads at the moment, which is a huge backlog. It will not be long before we're doing that at scale. The other thing about these machines, the beauty of them, much as we value our frontline workers, they can work all around the clock. They don't need to take a lunch break. They don't need to go on holiday. So actually, we can get through a huge amount more activity. Now, I do not ever envisage in healthcare a scenario where there isn't a hugely important role for highly trained clinical professionals. So the example I'd give you is you may have a machine read an MRI image. You do not want a machine to tell a person that they've been diagnosed with cancer. That's got to be a human-to-human interaction. But it's that symbiotic relationship that we need to develop. But I see huge opportunities for us to provide better, faster, fairer healthcare within the near term. I'm talking months and years. I'm not talking decades. If we could break through some of the barriers that we talked about in the first question.
I think it's crucially important as well as we think about workforce challenges, the friction, the burden. How do we start to lean into automation, RPA, AI, all these different components that can just unlock some of that resource and to re-divert it into places where it can be more patient-focused, more patient-centered. As clinical teams, we all know that we spend quite a bit of time doing that more administrative task, where now we can really be shifting that time, spending it sitting with the patient, giving them the diagnosis, not rushing through that. So it's exciting to see that. And I know at GSTT, there's a lot of enthusiasm both around RPA, but also around better understanding, federated data sets and how do we use the very rich data sets that we have to look at that. So it's exciting to see how this develops. And I agree with you, kind of months to years as opposed to decades. Chris, I wanted to ask, for here in the UK, this partnership is new, but you said GC has done many of these in the US. Would it be helpful, I think, to the audience to give maybe some key insights from that work? What approaches do you think will resonate within the UK context? Some things are obviously translatable across the pond, but what learnings did you take from your work with Intermountain or Jefferson or any of those other health systems that we can accelerate our learning through this partnership here in the UK?
Absolutely. So I think what Lauren's mentioned was really deeply important, an alignment strategically about delivering a new type of healthcare over a period of time, because that's important. If you don't have strategic alignment, no partnership is going to work. 2, very senior level buy-in, because ultimately, healthcare systems are hierarchical and there's only a certain pot of time and money to be deployed. And so when we forge these partnerships, it really is when the buy-in is there at a very, very senior level. That's where it's been most effective. Obviously, we need at various levels of the organization to execute, but you really need to have the C-suite saying, this is part of our journey, and we want to have and build a trusted relationship. And so the genesis of these relationships is not, transactional. It's not like a pitch and then we go from there. Even in the case of GSTT, I've known Nadine now, for some time and got to know Lawrence over a period of time. So they do gestate. I think we have been most effective where we can corral different parties to the table. The sort of honest broker. The startups may come in with a perspective on what they want to achieve. The systems may have a different perspective on what they want to achieve, and they're talking past each other. And we can sit down and say, guys, look, there is a 1 + 1 = 3 here if we all work together. And I think that's been enormously effective where we've been able to achieve that. Going back to the point that we're trying to address is we know, particularly as a result of the pandemic in the US, there's a proliferation of point solutions. The systems don't want a proliferation of point solutions. They're not effective, they're not integrated, they're often not understood. So how do we move beyond that? And we can say to these startups, look, actually let's think really consciously about who is your customer here and can we build together for that. And we've been able to start businesses from scratch around areas like CRM, which I mentioned, also hospital at home. We've done a lot around workforce transformation, and we're doing some interesting stuff around data and personalized data, and having this federation of healthcare systems together means that we can share learning. So Lawrence was mentioning earlier that one of the things he appreciated about this partnership is he can learn from others. Yes, the UK is different from the US or another market, but the problems are common. Healthcare is local, and so the regulatory may be different, but they're able to lean on and say, look, what works for you in your system, and how can we move our system forward? And I know we may disparage sometimes the UK health system, but actually the US looks to the UK as an innovator in many respects, right? And certainly a test bed for great product and advancements. So I think those are a couple of the things that are really important. But like any partnership, it's not one and done when you announce it. It's all about working together over a long period of time through the ebbs, the peaks and troughs that Lawrence mentioned, to deliver a common goal. And what we're focused on is how do we ultimately measure this, right? Because one of the things in healthcare that sometimes criticized around innovation is this truly lowering cost, or you adding incremental spend on top of the existing? And folks like Lawrence have to sort of fly the existing plane and build the new plane at the same time, and that's obviously really, really tricky and costly. So we're going to work with these system partners to sort of really try and identify impact from a cost perspective, a quality perspective, and then a customer experience perspective.
Takes me on to my next question, I guess, to Lawrence. As you know, there's a lot of innovators and inventors in the room and kind of watching online. Over the next few days, many of them will be pitching their projects and initiatives here as well. As an NHS clinician entrepreneur myself, I know the excitement of kind of setting up a healthcare company, seeing a problem and trying to solve it, creating and deploying a solution, but also the frustrations and barriers that can happen when you're trying to deploy within a big health system. You're obviously taking steps within the organization to fix that with City, with all the kind of cultural shift and behavior change that you described. But I would ask, how do you think this kind of cluster, this relationship as well, but also some of the work you're doing internally, will help encourage more clinicians and more innovators to bear fruit and come forward with their ideas as they're seeing those challenges firsthand? You kind of talked about it earlier, it's got to be clinically led. What's your kind of outlook now, given this partnership and also what you're doing internally?
Yeah, so I think healthcare is a very interesting industry. I'm not necessarily saying it's unique, but it's interesting in the sense that we have some of our smartest, most dynamic, sometimes our earlier stage career people right on the shop floor, at the front line of healthcare. And then the sort of people who occupy, the stodgy people who occupy the boardroom like me, but the real brains are out there on the shop floor with the patients. And I talk to a lot of people, not everyone's quite like Nadine, but some sort of mini versions of Nadine, let me say. We've got some fantastic people in our organization, real innovators. But the way I would summarize it is it feels to people like in order to innovate within a public health system, you often feel like you're swimming against the organizational tide, having to carve out time, often working in your own time, not paid time. There's sometimes in public systems a bit of a suspicion of enterprise and commerce, as I've talked about, very risk-averse approaches to change and regulation without looking at the counterbalancing risk of inaction. And so our ambition in the Centre for Innovation, Transformation, and Improvement that we've established within Guy's and St Thomas's is to really turn that tide around and really support our innovators to get their ideas implemented in practice. And then, once they've proven concept, once there's potentially a commercially viable product, we then have our new commercial arm, our venture arm, KHP Ventures, which Nadine leads, that can take them through to the full commercial cycle. So this is quite a novel approach. Now, I should just clarify, in case I've given the wrong impression, I am an absolute committed fan of the National Health Service. I've had a lot of my career in it, and I remain committed to it. But I think it's important in any industry that you hold the mirror up and you look at where you need to improve. And there's no doubt in my mind that if we want to regenerate a taxpayer-funded health service in this country to still be at the leading edge of healthcare provision for the next generation and generations, which I'm absolutely committed to doing, we need to take these bold steps. We need to innovate. We cannot ossify. And so my ambition for our organisation is to really be the place that people say, when they're coming out of medical training or surgical training, as Nadine did, you want to innovate, go to Guy's and St Thomas's. That's the place to go. And by the way, they're part of an international health assurance network led by GC, and really get that buzz going. I don't think we've quite got that yet, but that's the ambition. That's where we want to get to.
And I think it's what clinical teams want to see because, we are all, as you said, incredibly passionate about the NHS. We love what it stands for. We love this idea of, care at, that kind of free care, which you don't really see in other parts of the world. It's a jewel in our sort of crown, the NHS. But we need to make sure that we're building the right environment that encourages the right behaviors, retains great people, ideas, enables them to flourish. And I'm very optimistic that these kinds of partnerships and the work that you're doing, Lawrence, at GSTT with City and others are those paths that are going to help us get there. I have a couple more questions. I know we've only got about 5 minutes left, so one will be really quick, and then a more broader one is, I want to talk about data because that's always kind of like the elephant in the room. People want to talk about data, don't want to talk about data. It often unlocks a can of worms. It's always misrepresented. It can be misrepresented in the press. And so perhaps, Lawrence first, and then Chris, I'd love your perspective. What do you see the role of data playing within this reimagining and this future innovation in healthcare? And what should be the message that we should be putting out, both to the public and to anyone here in the room today?
Yeah, sure. So I think if we look at some of the innovations that have happened in healthcare, they often get so far and then they fall into a big pit, often because of errors in how things are done. So I am absolutely clear that we have a fundamental responsibility as a hospital to protect the confidentiality of our patient data, the security of our patient data, and for it only to be used for those purposes that patients have consented for. That said, we hear a lot from a very vocal but very small minority of people who are very much against the use of data for not necessarily research, but for commercially based research. What we don't hear about is from the much larger silent majority who actually say to us all the time the opposite problem, which is, why am I having to tell my story again? Why am I having to input this data again? Don't you people speak to each other? Don't you use the data? So actually, the expectation of the vast majority of the public is that we are doing much more to maximize the potential of the huge data sets we've got, not only for their individual care, but for the collective good of research and enterprise. So actually, we have to be mindful of that small minority. I'm not in any way doing that down. We have to be careful of our responsibilities. But there is a much broader push, and we see it, we see it in so many other things. How many times you look at your webmail and you mention something about a washing machine and there's an advert for a washing machine, and that's just part of life. You know why that's washing machines come up. Now, healthcare is a bit different. People are sensitive about aspects of their data, but I guess in my imagination in the future, you would have a system like you have with your social media, where you can check the boxes and control your settings about who you want to share your data with, which updates live to either cloud storage or wherever the secure data environment is. And you can control how your data is used, and you can lock it off to certain things. And I guarantee if we could get to that place securely, the vast majority of patients actually are quite open to their data being used on an anonymized basis for research, for enterprise, as well as obviously for health planning and so on.
And I think it's one of the great advantages of the NHS is they do have all this longitudinal data, right? But there's trillions of gigabytes of data just locked because people are worried about patient safety. It's trapped in systems that can't talk to each other. And so if we can find a way, using the latest technologies, you mentioned federated learning, multi-sites, where data is not held on site by an intermediary, it's shared, but it's de-identified, and there's no risk of transfer of that personal information. I think it can do wonders, right? Because we're so early in really the use of data in healthcare. And again, back to the UK, we have better data. In the US, it's deeply fragmented, that data. And, CMS has got 2,000 people. There's no way they can, assess all the data on their own, right? But in the UK, we have this more centralized system that is a common public system. So I really do think if we're going to play to our strengths, we've got to use them.
I would agree, and just highlight that one of the great things I've seen happen at GSTT more recently is just a whole revamping of the data policy. How do we become easier to work with? How do we create sandbox sort of anonymized data sets to give access to smaller companies to testbed their technologies in a safe environment with data being pulled from multiple centers in a way that really helps these technologies either succeed and hopefully succeed in scale or fail quickly if it's not going to work, but try and figure that out earlier rather than sort of 5 years into the journey because you're going around the houses trying to collect bits and bits of data.
Right, and then because GSTT has this very diverse population, some of the biases that you sometimes find in data, GSTT can be really interesting in terms of saying, well, look, we are actually covering a huge spectrum of people, and so we're not identifying, solutions that only fit a very small subset of the population.
That's such an important thing. There are so many products now, devices, algorithms where we now can identify known bias. And actually, if we're going to eliminate that bias for our own populations, but also to scale in the very large emerging markets in Africa and Asia, we need to be able to develop products that are viable and tested on those kind of populations. And we have that opportunity, this world's population in South London that I like to talk about.
I'm enjoying this too much, but final question to you both as we have, and then I'll offer up to final comments. We've got obviously industry in the audience today and across the sort of the session. We've got SMEs, we've got investors, we've got all, people from all walks of life across health tech. How can you see relationships with medtech companies, big and small, best interacting with the NHS? And how central is that to the collaboration and to the future success of the NHS?
Yeah. So, if I kind of refer back to what I said at the start, it's pretty clear that the way that the health service is going in this country, we're at something of an inflection point. Unless we are able to innovate at scale, we are frankly running out of people to provide healthcare in the way we're doing it at the moment. And we see waiting times increasing. We see patient and public satisfaction dropping quite fast. So, we have an absolute imperative to innovate, to redesign the ways in which we deliver healthcare fit for the mid-21st century, and we can only do that by working with industry. And the kind of principles I talked about earlier for industry partnerships of strategic alignment, trust, there are some that are transactional, but actually the deeper strategic partnerships are going to deliver long-term gain rather than point solutions are likely to be longer-term, not transactional arrangements. So I guess what I would like to say is, as an organisation, we want to be very much open to working with industry, particularly through our venture arm, King's Health Partners Ventures, which you can contact Nadine and she'll give you all the details. And we see ourselves as we want to become a really good portal into this translational testbed that we have for operational services, for a data environment in the National Health Service.
Thank you. Any final comments from both of you? I know we've come to time, but...
Well, thank you, first of all, Nadine, for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you both for coming. Thank you. We'll come back next year and you can update us on this partnership.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.